A suitcase hit the front porch and burst open, clothes scattered across wet concrete, a yellow blouse, a cardigan with pearl buttons, a pair of orthopedic shoes that landed sole up in a puddle near the steps. A hand had shoved hard between her shoulder blades, not a push, a dismissal, and Leonora Ashford stumbled forward and grabbed the iron railing with both hands to keep from going down. Behind her, the front door slammed shut. A deadbolt turned, then a chain slid into place. She stood there in a house coat and thin-soled slippers, breathing hard through her nose, staring at a door that used to be hers to walk through without knocking. Two crumpled dollar bills sat in her palm. She didn't remember putting them there. They must have been in her pocket from the last time she'd walked to the corner store. Change from a loaf of bread. That was everything she had on this earth. No phone, no wallet, no keys. Not a bag with her medication. Not a photograph. Not a single thing that said she had ever existed beyond this porch. She looked at the door for a full minute. Not one person on that street looked twice. A car pulled into the driveway across the road. The driver, a man in a gray fleece, glanced at her, looked away, and went inside. A woman walking a terrier crossed to the other side of the block. A kid on a bicycle rode past without slowing. Nora bent down and picked up what she could reach. The yellow blouse, the cardigan, a pair of wool socks. She pressed them into the broken suitcase and held the latch together with her left hand because it no longer caught. Then she walked down the porch steps and turned left and kept walking. No plan, no destination. One foot in front of the other down a suburban street in central Ohio on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The sky was the color of old dishwater. The trees had already dropped most of their leaves. Her name was Leonora Ashford. People who loved her called her Nora. She was 72 years old. She had raised 3 children, buried a husband, survived a foreclosure, and spent 8 years making herself as small and quiet as possible inside someone else's house. And she did not cry. That is the first thing you need to understand about this woman. Crying had been trained out of her a long time ago. Not by cruelty exactly, by repetition, by the steady accumulation of moments where crying changed nothing and silence cost less. She had learned early that the world moved faster and easier when she took up less space inside it. She had spent a lifetime perfecting that particular skill. She was still perfecting it as she walked down the street with a broken suitcase and $2. To understand how Nora ended up on that porch, you have to go back 8 years. Fletcher Ashford died on a Saturday morning in March of 2016. He was 68 years old, and he was changing the oil on his truck when his heart simply stopped. Nora found him in the garage at 10:30 when she went to call him in for breakfast. He was on the concrete floor next to the truck with a wrench still in his hand. The coffee she'd poured for him was still warm on the kitchen counter. Fletcher had handled the money. All of it. Every bill, every tax return, every savings account. He handled it the way men of his generation often did, quietly, completely, without explanation. Nora never asked to see a statement. She never questioned the arrangement. That was the deal they had built their marriage on, and for 31 years it had seemed to work. After the funeral, it stopped working. It took 6 weeks for the full picture to emerge, and it emerged the way bad news always does, in pieces, each one worse than the last. The first letter came from the mortgage company, then a second letter from a different mortgage company. There was a second mortgage on the house that Nora had never known existed. Then came the credit card statements. 4 cards in Fletcher's name, carrying balances that suggested years of minimum payments and accumulating interest. Then a letter from the IRS about back taxes. Nora sat at the kitchen table with all of it spread in front of her and tried to understand what she was reading. She was not a stupid woman. She had run a household for decades and raised 3 children largely on her own, while Fletcher worked double shifts at the manufacturing plant. But she had never seen these numbers before. She had never been shown this version of their life. She hired an accountant. The accountant took 3 days and then sat across from her with an expression that told her everything before he opened his mouth. Fletcher had not been hiding money from her. He had been hiding the absence of money. The second mortgage had been taken out 11 years earlier to cover a period when the plant had cut hours. The credit cards had filled gaps, then gaps in the gaps. But there was one more layer underneath all of it, and this was the layer that explained why Garrett had stood at the coffee maker with his back turned and his hands in his pockets and said nothing. 7 years before Fletcher died, Garrett had come to his father with a business idea, a logistics venture, a partnership with a college friend, something that had seemed solid on paper. Fletcher had believed in his son the way fathers do, and he had co-signed a loan he never told Nora about. The venture failed within 18 months. The debt transferred back to Fletcher. And for 7 years, Fletcher had carried it quietly rather than tell his son the weight of what his silence had cost. Garrett knew. He had known since the day his father called him and said the venture had collapsed and he would handle it. He had let his father handle it. He had watched his mother lose the house and the car and the furniture and move into his spare room, and he had stood at that coffee maker every morning for 8 years with the knowledge of what his silence had helped create, and he had said nothing. That was why he could not turn around. That was why he never defended her. The bank took the house in September of 2016. The truck followed. Then the furniture there couldn't fit into storage. Nora walked out of the foreclosure with 2 suitcases and a box of photo albums, and the understanding that the life she had believed she was living had been in some significant ways a fiction maintained by a man who loved her too much to tell her the truth. She did not say this out loud to anyone. She just carried it. Her son Garrett called the day after the foreclosure was finalized. He said there was a spare room. He said it like it was the simplest thing in the world because to him it probably was. His mother needed a place. He had a place. The problem had a solution. What he did not say and what Nora did not yet know was that the spare room was also a form of penance. And penance paid in silence looks identical to generosity from the outside. Nora accepted because she had no other choice, and she understood the difference between those two things. The house was a colonial in a subdivision outside Columbus. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a finished basement that Garrett used as a home office, in a backyard with a gas grill that got covered with a tarp every November. It was a fine house, a comfortable house. Nora moved into the spare room on the second floor at the end of October 2016 and told herself it was temporary. Temporary lasted 8 years. In the beginning, it worked. Nora cooked, she cleaned, she did the laundry and kept the kitchen organized and picked up her granddaughter June from school 3 afternoons a week. She was useful in the way that a person becomes useful when they understand their position, precisely when they know that warmth must be earned and space must be justified. Garrett was not a bad man. He was a man who had learned somewhere along the way to avoid conflict by letting it resolve itself. He had a good job in corporate logistics, in a nice car, and a love for his mother that was genuine but untested. He had never been required to choose between his mother and anything else that mattered to him. When that requirement came, the choice he made revealed something about him that Nora suspected but had never wanted to confirm. Miriam was the one who ran the household. She was 49, a project manager, precise and organized, and deeply uncomfortable with uncertainty. She had grown up watching her own mother dissolve slowly into dependency. First small things, then larger things, then everything, until Miriam's teenage years had been structured entirely around managing a woman who could not manage herself. Her mother had died in a Medicaid nursing facility at 63 in a room with a window that faced a parking lot. Miriam had decided with the quiet ferocity of someone who has been burned that she would never be that person's child. She would never let love become obligation, become resentment, become a room with a parking lot view. That decision had been reasonable and understandable, and it had shaped everything that followed. The comments started in year 3. Little ones first, Miriam would mention the water bill and let her eyes drift toward the hallway where Nora's room was. She would sigh while putting groceries away and say something about how quickly things ran out with an extra person in the house. She would make observations about the cost of utilities in winter, about the wear on the washing machine, about how 3 people ate compared to 2. Nora heard every word. She had spent a lifetime hearing things that weren't said directly. She said nothing. She cooked more. She cleaned more. She ate after Garrett and Miriam. She turned her television down to near silence. She stopped using the downstairs bathroom during morning hours so the schedule wouldn't be disrupted. By year 5, the comments weren't comments anymore. They were conversations that happened in the master bedroom with the door not quite closed, loud enough. Miriam's voice carrying through the wall with the particular clarity of someone who is not entirely sure whether they want to be overheard. She said the house was too crowded. She said 3 adults in one space was not what she had planned for. She said they needed to think about options. Real options, not just leave things the way they were indefinitely. Garrett's voice was lower, harder to make out, but he never raised it. He never pushed back. He let Miriam talk until she was done, and then he agreed in the tone of a man who has decided that agreement is a form of survival. Nora lay in her bed on the other side of the wall and stared at the ceiling and thought about her mother. Iris Calloway had died alone in a cabin in upstate New York in the winter of 1990. Pneumonia. No one found her for 3 days. She had been 61 years old. Nora had been 38, living in Ohio with 3 kids and a husband who needed dinner on the table, and when the call came from a county sheriff's deputy in a town called Millhaven, she had wept for 2 days and then told herself she would deal with it later. Later had never come. The cabin had been sealed according to Iris's will. The instructions were specific enough to be strange: seal the cabin, do not sell it, do not rent it, do not open it. Nora had always thought that was eccentric. Her mother had always been a private woman, a contained woman, someone who kept her own counsel and rarely explained herself. Nora had assumed the instructions were about pride, about not wanting her things picked through by strangers. She had not gone back to Millhaven for the funeral. She had not gone back for any reason in the 34 years since. She had told herself she would someday. Someday was still waiting when Miriam slid the brochures across the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in October 2024. Nora was eating toast when it happened. She heard Miriam come downstairs, heard the deliberate way she walked into the kitchen and placed both palms flat on the counter. That sound, flat palms on a counter, meant a prepared conversation. Nora had heard it before about smaller things. She put down her toast. Miriam said she wanted to talk. She said they had been looking into options: senior living communities, assisted care. There were some really good ones, not far away places with activities and people. Nora's own age places where she'd have her own space and her own routine. She said it would be better for everyone. She pushed 3 brochures across the table. Nora looked at them. Then she looked at Garrett. He was standing at the coffee maker with his back turned. He had not moved since she looked up. He would not turn around. She watched the back of his shoulders and understood something she had been refusing to understand for a long time: that her son was not going to speak. Not now, not in her defense, not in any way that cost him anything. The debt he carried from his father's silence had become his own silence, and he would stand at the coffee maker until this was over, and then he would go to work, and the thing would be done, and he would never have to meet her eyes during it. Nora said she understood. She got up from the table and left her toast half-eaten and went to her room and started packing. It did not take long. She had never accumulated much. She had learned not to. She had her 2 suitcases open on the bed and half-filled when Miriam appeared in the doorway. Her voice was different now, less prepared. She said a friend had called about a facility that had an opening right now today, and she thought it was better to move on it quickly. Nora asked for one more day. Miriam said no. She said it quietly, without cruelty, without pleasure. She said it the way someone says something they have already decided and do not intend to reconsider. And when Nora did not move quickly enough, when she stood there with a folded sweater in her hands, trying to process what was happening to her, Miriam took the nearest suitcase by the handle, carried it to the porch, and set it down too hard. The latch was old. It gave. The case burst open on the wet concrete. Nora followed her own luggage out the door. The hand between her shoulder blades was not violent. It was efficient. The deadbolt took 2 seconds. The chain made a soft sound like something being finalized. She stood on the porch of her son's house with $2 bills in her housecoat pocket and a broken suitcase at her feet and the cold October air on her face. And somewhere upstairs behind a second-floor window, with the curtain pulled slightly aside, June Ashford stood and watched her grandmother gather her clothes off the wet concrete. The girl was 17 years old. She had heard everything through the heating vent in her bedroom floor, every conversation, every word through the wall for the past 3 years. She watched her grandmother bend down with careful dignity and press the yellow blouse and the pearl button cardigan back into the broken case. June did not come downstairs. She did not open the window. She did not call out. She stood there and watched, and then she let the curtain fall, and that moment would stay with her longer than she knew. 11 blocks to the Greyhound station. The left slipper started losing its soul at block 6. It peeled away from the bottom and folded back, and Nora had to adjust her stride to keep it from coming off entirely. By block 9, it was flapping with each step. She held the broken suitcase closed with her left hand and walked. The bus station was a single room with plastic seats and a route board and a smell of floor cleaner and old coffee. A man behind a scratched plexiglass window looked at her the way people look at something they have decided not to engage with. Nora studied the board. She had grown up in Millhaven, New York. She had left at 18 years old, gotten on a bus very much like the ones parked outside right now, and gone south and west and not looked back. She had built a life that looked fine from the outside. She had married and raised children and kept a home and been a decent person by any measure she could apply. She had not been back to Millhaven in 54 years. A one-way ticket to the nearest stop to Millhaven cost $1.90. Nora slid the 2 bills under the plexiglass. The man pushed back a ticket and a dime. She looked at the dime for a moment and then put it in her pocket next to nothing. She found a seat at the back of the bus with the suitcase between her knees and her hands folded in her lap. The woman next to her fell asleep before they cleared the city limits. A man across the aisle ate a sandwich and looked at his phone. Nobody looked at Nora. She had spent a lifetime not being looked at, and she had almost made her peace with it. 6 hours. No food, no water, no phone to call anyone, even if there had been someone she wanted to call. She watched Ohio flatten and then compress into the rolling hills of western Pennsylvania. The towns grew smaller and further apart. The spaces between them widened into farmland and then forest. By the time the light started going amber in the west, she could smell pine through the cracked window seal and something else underneath it, cold water stone, the particular sharpness of high-elevation air. She had forgotten she remembered that smell. It came back all at once, like a door opened from the other side. The bus stopped at a gas station on a 2-lane state road 3 miles outside Millhaven. The driver announced the stop without looking up. Nora was the only one who got off. She stood in the parking lot with her broken suitcase and looked around. The mountains were exactly where she had left them. That was the thing about mountains they didn't move for. You didn't shift their position based on how long you'd been gone or how much you'd changed. They simply remained, patient, indifferent, permanent in a way that nothing in her life had managed to be. The gas station had a single clerk, a young man with a feed store cap, who looked up when she pushed the door open. She asked if he knew the way to the old Callaway property on the east side of town. He didn't. A woman outside filling her tank overheard. She straightened up and pointed east and gave directions in the careful way of someone who has given them many times. Past the grain elevator, past what used to be the elementary school, down a gravel road that followed the creek. Nora thanked her and started walking. The gravel road was not maintained. It had ruts from rain and places where the creek had crept over the bank and left deposits of silt and small stones across the path. The slipper gave out completely at the 40-minute mark. The sole tore free, and Nora stopped long enough to pull it off and walk on in the sock alone. Her feet found the cold of the ground through the thin wool. At the hour mark, she took the other slipper off too and carried both in her free hand. Her feet were bleeding before she saw the cabin. It appeared past an overgrown field where the road curved a low shape behind a rusted iron gate that had collapsed inward on one side, leaving a gap just wide enough to walk through. The field between the gate and the cabin had gone fully wild goldenrod and thistle, chest-high sumac trees, pushing up along the fence line a volunteer elm that had grown from a crack in the stone wall to a height of 20 feet. But the cabin was still standing. Stone foundation, wooden frame the color of old pewter, a tin roof gone rust brown but intact, no visible holes, no collapsed sections. The porch had two steps and a rail that had pulled partly away from the post but was still attached. The windows were shuttered from the inside with plywood, and across the front door, nailed in the pattern, she remembered from the letter of instructions she'd received from a county official in 1990, were two lengths of 2x4 lumber crossed in an X, sealed, just like the will had said. Nora pushed through the broken gate. The goldenrod was wet from an earlier rain and it soaked her socks immediately. She pushed through it with her arm across her face and emerged on what had once been a path to the porch. The boards groaned under her weight. She stood at the door and looked at those boards. They had been up there for 34 years. She did not have a hammer. She did not have any tool at all. She stood there on bleeding feet after a 6-hour bus ride with no food and 10 cents to her name, and looked at the boards her dead mother had put there before she died. Then she went back to the gate. The iron railing that had collapsed inward had come free of one of its anchor posts. The anchor post itself was still in the ground, but the railing section was loose, a 4-foot length of rusted iron with a flanged end. She worked it back and forth until it pulled fully free. She went back to the door and worked the flanged end into the gap between the first board and the door frame. It took 20 minutes. The nails were old, but they were set deep and the wood around them had dried and hardened over 3 decades of freeze and thaw. Nora's palms blistered and then split. Blood ran down the iron railing and onto the porch boards. She worked each nail loose in sequence, prying evenly from both sides so the wood didn't split. She worked until the boards came free. Both of them. The door behind them was unlocked. She put her hand on the knob and turned it, and the door swung inward on hinges that moved without sound, as if they had been oiled recently, as if someone had tended to them. The darkness inside was soft and dry, no mildew, no animal smell, no rot. Nora stood in the doorway of her dead mother's cabin and breathed. The air was cool and still, like the inside of a kept promise. She stepped in. The furniture was covered in white sheets, 6 or 7 pieces arranged exactly as she remembered from childhood. She reached out and pulled the nearest one free. Underneath a wooden armchair with curved arms and a rush seat. No rot, no mildew. She ran her palm along the arm and felt the smoothness of old wood that had been waxed before it was covered. She pulled another sheet. The kitchen table, polished maple intact, the surface still carrying the faint sheen of wax applied by someone who expected it to be used again someday. She moved through the cabin slowly. She opened cabinets, dishes stacked in order, glasses without a crack. She opened the drawer beside the sink, and her mother's kitchen scissors were in the same place they had always been, the small drawer to the right of the sink blade end back. She stood and held the scissors for a moment. They were just scissors. But they were her mother's scissors, and they were exactly where her mother had put them. And after the day she had just lived through, that precision felt like something close to grace. The pantry shelf held jars, preserves, pickled vegetables, wax-sealed lids still tight. A jar of peach preserves with the year written on the masking tape label in her mother's block printing. 1989, a year before Iris died. Nora took the peach jar down and held it. She walked to the cast iron sink and worked the hand pump. It was stiff at first. She primed it with the small jug of water that sat beside it, and after 4 or 5 strokes, the water came up cold and clear. She cupped her hands and drank. The taste was iron and cold stone, and something else she couldn't name. Her mother had drunk this water every day of her life in this cabin. Nora set the peach jar on the table and stood in the middle of her dead mother's kitchen and felt something she had not felt in so long. She had nearly forgotten the word for it. Safe. Not comfortable, not warm, not provided for. Just safe. No one was going to come to this door tonight. No one was going to slide anything across the table at her. No one was going to turn their back while her life was being arranged without her input. She found blankets in a cedar chest at the foot of the single bed. She made a place on the sofa. She opened the peach preserves and ate half the jar with the kitchen spoon she found in the drawer beside the scissors. 34 years in a sealed jar. They were still sweet. She lay down and pulled the blanket to her chin and closed her eyes. Her feet had stopped bleeding. The cabin was cold, but not unbearably cold. She could hear the creak somewhere east of the cabin, just audible through the walls, steady and low. She did not dream. Her body had finally decided it was somewhere it could trust, and it did what bodies do when that happens, it let go. Sleep came down like a curtain, complete and quiet and without interruption. Outside, the October night settled over the mountains. She woke before the sun was fully up. The cabin was gray lit and cold, the kind of cold that settles into stone foundations overnight and holds there until well past noon. Nora lay still for a moment under the blanket, looking at the ceiling. Exposed beams, old-growth pine, no sagging, no water stains. She listened to the creek. It was still there, still steady, the same note it had always held. She sat up slowly. Her feet had dried overnight. The cuts from the gravel road had crusted over. She found her mother's rubber boots beside the back door and wore them with 2 pairs of wool socks from the cedar chest. She found a heavy wool cardigan on a hook in the back hallway, dark green, the kind of garment made to last. She put it on over her house coat and opened the interior shutters one by one. Each window she uncovered changed the quality of light in the space. By the time she had opened the last one in the back bedroom, the cabin had filled with the pale gold of early morning, filtered through bare trees, and it looked like something that had been waiting patiently for exactly this, to be let in again, to be seen. She stood in the kitchen and ate the second half of the peach preserves, standing up straight from the jar, and washed it down with cold water from the pump. Then she went to the fireplace. On the mantel, half hidden behind a framed photograph, her mother and an older woman she didn't know standing in front of what looked like the grain elevator in town summer, both of them squinting into the sun, was an envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with red wax that had hardened and darkened to the color of dried blood. On the front, in her mother's careful block, printing a single word, Leonora, not Nora, her full name, the name on her birth certificate, the name Iris had given her and almost no one had used since. Nora picked it up and held it for a long time without opening it. Then she broke the wax and opened it. The letter inside was 2 pages written on lined paper in the same block printing as the envelope. The ink had faded slightly, but every word was legible. Iris Calloway had written clearly and deliberately, as she had done everything in her life. The letter began with 3 words. I knew you'd come, not if you come. Not, I hoped you would, I knew you'd come, said with the absolute certainty of a woman who had spent 34 years being right about the one thing that mattered most to her. The letter did not begin with apologies or explanations. It began with instructions delivered in the same practical voice Iris had used to teach Nora how to prime a water pump and put up preserves and read a deed. Go to the cellar. The combination is your birthday, month, day, year. Open the door. Everything you need is below. And then one more line before the instructions continued on page 2. The lock will open on the first try. I made sure of it. Nora read that line twice, then a third time. She thought about her mother in the last years of her life, alone in this cabin, 60 years old, going down into that cellar and turning that dial over and over, checking and rechecking, making sure the combination held, making sure the mechanism was clean and the numbers aligned perfectly, making sure that when her daughter finally came, not If when the lock would open on the first try because her daughter would be coming from somewhere difficult and she would not need one more thing to resist her. Nora pressed her hand flat against the letter and stood very still. Then she went to find the cellar. She found the hatch in the pantry under a braided rag rug she remembered from childhood. Her mother had made it from strips of worn-out clothing and an old house dress, a pair of work trousers, a flannel shirt that had belonged to someone whose name Nora had never known. The colors had faded, but the weave was still tight. She rolled it back, and there was the hatch, flush to the floor, iron rings set into the wood, a brass padlock through the hasp, old but solid. Nora knelt on the cold floor. Her birthday, October 14th, 1952. She set the dial. 14:52. The lock opened. First try. She pulled the hatch up. A smell came up from below earth cedar, something cool and mineral like stone and shadow. She found the wooden stairs with her foot and descended slowly, one hand on the wall, into the dark. There was a pull string light at the bottom. When she pulled it, a single bare bulb came on and showed her the room. It was not large, perhaps 8 feet by 10, but every inch of wall space was used. Shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 sides, and on those shelves, organized with a precision that belonged in a professional archive, were boxes, manila folders, leather binders, cardboard storage boxes sealed with packing tape that had yellowed but held firm. And on every box in Iris Calloway's block print handwriting, a label: land, legal, personal, each word in capital letters, each box numbered within its category. Nora stood at the bottom of the stairs in her dead mother's rubber boots and looked at what Iris had built down here, and she understood before she opened a single box that this had taken years. This had taken discipline and patience and a kind of long-range thinking that most people never manage. Her mother had built a law office under her kitchen floor. Nora took the first box off the shelf, the one labeled land. She brought it upstairs to the kitchen table and opened it in the morning light. Inside were deeds, property deeds, each one in a protective sleeve, each one notarized and dated and stamped with the county clerk's seal. She laid them out one by one. The cabin and its immediate quarter-acre plot, a field to the north, 14 acres, a section of forest to the west, 21 acres, creek frontage along the entire eastern boundary, 7 acres, total 42 acres, all contiguous, all in the name of Iris Calloway, legally recorded at the Millhaven County Clerk's office. Nora looked at the tax receipts filed in the same box. Annual, every year, going back to 1972, paid in full each time from an account at a bank in Albany, New York. She turned to the most recent receipt, filed 8 months ago, paid through 2027. Someone had been making those payments, quietly, faithfully. For decades after Iris was dead and the cabin was sealed, and the world had moved on and forgotten this piece of land existed, she put the land box to one side and reached for trust. The trust box held bank statements going back to 1971. A trust account opened at an Albany bank in November of that year with an initial deposit of $5,000. Monthly contributions after that, small at first $25, $50, increasing over time, $200 a month through the 1980s, $500 a month through the 1990s, $1,000 a month after 2000, interest compounding, dividends reinvesting, the balance growing the way balances grow when no one touches them for decades. The most recent statement had been printed 6 months ago and mailed to the office of Hewitt and Associates Attorneys at Law, Millhaven, New York. Current balance $412,000. Nora set the statement down on the table. She picked it up again and read the number a second time, then a third time. Yesterday, she had been eating toast at her son's kitchen table. 24 hours ago, she had been standing on a porch with 2 crumpled bills and nowhere on earth to go. This morning, she had been walking on a gravel road with bleeding feet. And underneath her mother's kitchen floor, in a room that smelled like cedar and cold stone, sealed behind a combination lock keyed to her birthday, was $412,000. She pressed her knuckles against the table and made herself breathe normally. Then she reached for the third box, the small one on the bottom shelf, wrapped in a piece of green wool cloth and tied with kitchen twine. No label. She set it on the table and unwrapped it. Inside, in a protective plastic sleeve that had been sealed at the edges with packing tape, was a document, a birth certificate, Nora's birth certificate, but not the one she had grown up with. Not the one she had used for her passport, for her marriage license, for every official form she had filled out in 72 years. This one had been issued by a different county office, and the line that read "Father" was different. On the certificate, she had always known that line read Harold Calloway. On this one, it read Thomas Aldridge. Nora set the document down on the table. She stepped back from it. One step, then another. She stood with her back against the kitchen counter and looked at it from across the room the way you look at something that might be dangerous. Thomas Aldridge. She knew that name. Anyone who had grown up in Mill Haven knew that name. The Aldridges had owned the largest dairy operation in the county for 3 generations. They had built the public library on Main Street. The bronze plaque above the entrance read Aldridge Library, donated 1958. They had funded the volunteer fire department's first proper station. Thomas Aldridge had been the patriarch of all the old money church every Sunday, the kind of man whose opinion could get a road paved or a loan approved. He had died in 1992. His obituary had run on the front page of 3 regional newspapers. Harold Calloway had been a factory worker who drank too much and broke things when he was angry and walked out of their lives when Nora was 7 years old in 1959 without a forwarding address or a word of explanation. He had been a ghost after that, not present enough to be a father, not gone enough to stop shaping everything. Nora had spent 65 years believing she was his daughter. She went back to the table and picked up the letter. Page 2. Her mother's handwriting was steady and clear. No hesitation in the strokes. Iris Calloway had written this the same way she had written everything, directly, without decoration, without asking forgiveness for the facts. Thomas and I were together for 2 years before you were born. He was already married. He had a family, a name, a position in this town that he was not willing to risk. When I told him I was pregnant, he offered to pay me to go away quietly. I said no. He offered to take you and raise you as his own inside his family under his name. I said no to that too. I was not going to let my daughter grow up as somebody's secret inside somebody else's house. He didn't push. He accepted my terms. He set up the trust account himself through his attorney, Franklin Hewitt. He purchased the surrounding land and put it in my name. He said it was for you for when the time came. He asked only that I never tell his family. I married Harold Calloway 6 months before you were born because I needed a name on a certificate and Harold needed someone to cook his meals. When he left, I was relieved. I want you to understand that. His leaving was not a wound, it was a resolution. I sealed the cabin because I did not trust Thomas's family after he was gone. They are land people. They see acreage and they see money, and they do not stop until they have acquired what they believe belongs to them. If they found out about you after I was gone, they would have come for the land. They would have challenged the trust. They would have buried everything under paperwork and legal fees until there was nothing left to claim. So I buried it first, in a place only you could find, in a room only your birthday could open. I knew you would need it someday. I knew the world would give you reasons to need it. I am sorry I could not give it to you sooner or in a better way, or while I was still here to explain. Come home, Leonora, it was always yours. Nora read the letter through twice. Then she set it down carefully and went to the window and looked out at the field behind the cabin, where the goldenrod was bent with the weight of morning dew, and she thought about Harold Calloway. She thought about the way he used to sit at the kitchen table with a glass he refilled too many times and find fault with things, the way a room changed temperature when he was in it, the way she had learned very young to make herself invisible when his mood was heading in a particular direction. She thought about the 7 years she had spent in his orbit learning to be careful and quiet and small, and the 65 years after that when she had carried those lessons without ever questioning where they came from or whether they were hers to keep. She had been a woman who asked permission to exist in rooms that should have been hers by right. She had been a woman who ate after others spoke, after others waited until the room had decided she was allowed to contribute. She had been that woman because of a man who was not her father. She stood at the window for a long time. Then she went back to the shelf for the fourth box. The fourth box was different from the others. No neat label, just a collection of envelopes, correspondence going back 15 years, all addressed to the estate of Iris Calloway. She pulled the first envelope and read the letter inside. A real estate inquiry, polite professional expressing interest in acquiring the Calloway parcel. The second letter was similar. A year later, slightly more specific about price. By the seventh letter, the language had changed. Words like unresolved estate and county procedure and timeline for adverse claim. By the 11th, the letterhead read Aldridge Land Partners LLC, and the attorney's name at the bottom was associated with one of Albany's largest property firms. 11 letters, spanning 15 years, each one circling the same piece of land like something patient and inevitable. And the most recent letter, dated 3 weeks ago, contained language that Nora understood well enough without understanding all of it. The Aldridge entity was preparing to file for adverse possession through the county court. They believed the property had been abandoned. They believed there was no living heir. The filing date was scheduled for the following week. Nora read that line twice. She had arrived with days to spare, possibly less. She stacked the 4 boxes in a careful row on the kitchen table and stood back and looked at them. 4 boxes, 4 decades of quiet preparation, a trust account that had grown in silence, a land holding that had been tended and taxed and kept current through the deaths of 2 people and the indifference of a world that had never known it existed. Her mother had done all of this, a woman with no legal training, no money of her own beyond what Thomas Aldridge had provided, no allies she had ever mentioned, had built this with patience and discipline and a belief that was absolute that her daughter would come, that she would need it, that the door would hold until she got there. Nora sat down in the chair by the fireplace. Her mother's chair, the one with the curved arms and the rush seat. The cushion was the same fabric, the same pattern of faded blue flowers. She sat in it and thought about Iris, about what it had cost her to keep the secret, to live in this cabin alone for decades without telling her daughter why. She thought about the winter of 1990, Iris, alone in this room with pneumonia, getting worse, too proud or too careful to call the one person who might have come. She thought about 3 days passing before anyone found her. Iris had chosen the secret over the rescue. She had decided at the end that the thing she was protecting mattered more than being found in time. Nora did not know if that was wisdom or stubbornness or love so deep it had become indistinguishable from all three. She suspected it was all three at once, which was probably the truest thing about her mother she had ever understood. She had 2 choices. She could take the money and the land quietly, establish the trust disbursement, sell the acreage privately, and disappear into a comfortable retirement somewhere no one would look for her. Or she could do what her mother had never been able to do. She could walk into town and say her name out loud. She sat in Iris's chair until the light shifted and the cabin warmed slightly around her, and the decisions settled into her chest the way decisions do when they stop being decisions and become simply what you are going to do. She was not going to disappear. She had been disappearing her whole life. She had been Harold Calloway's invisible daughter, and Fletcher Ashford's uninformed wife, and Garrett's convenient mother, and Miriam's inconvenient problem, and she had taken up less and less space at each station until she had arrived at a porch in Ohio with $2 and a broken suitcase. That was as small as she was going to get. She stood up from the chair. She found Iris's work boots by the back door, real ones, leather ankle height, stiff with age but sound. She put on 3 pairs of wool socks and worked her feet in. She collected the 4 boxes from the kitchen table and put them in a canvas bag she found on a hook in the back hallway. She looked at the letter one more time. Both pages. Her mother's block print on faded lined paper. Come home, Leonora. It was always yours. She folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of the green cardigan against her ribs. Then she walked out the front door and started toward town. For the first time in 8 years, she was walking towards something instead of away from it. The law office of Hewitt and Associates occupied a converted Victorian house on the main street of Mill Haven, 3 blocks east of the grain elevator, and 2 blocks from the library that bore the Aldridge name above its entrance in bronze letters. Nora stood on the sidewalk and looked at that plaque before she went inside. Aldridge Library, donated 1958. Thomas Aldridge had donated a library to this town 6 years after his daughter was born, and 4 years after he had set up a trust account to ensure that daughter would never be destitute. He had done both things quietly and without anyone connecting them. She turned and went inside. The front room held 2 chairs and a reception desk. A door at the back was open. Through it, she could see a man at a desk, jacket on despite the indoor warmth, reading something in a manila folder with the focused attention of someone who reads carefully for a living. Nora knocked on the open door. The man looked up. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, gray at the temples, and in the close-cut beard he wore, with the kind of face that had been weathered by decades of other people's difficult circumstances into something steady and unshockable. He looked at Nora housecoat visible below the green cardigan, leather work boots, lace-tight canvas bag hanging from one arm, and his expression did not change. She said her name. She said it fully, both names, the way her mother had written it on the envelope. Leonora Ashford, born October 14th, 1952, daughter of Iris Calloway of Mill Haven, New York. The man set down the folder. He was quiet for a moment, very still, in the way of someone who has just heard something they have been waiting a long time to hear and needs a moment to confirm it is real. Then he said his name, Calhoun Hewitt. He said people called him Cal. He asked her to sit down. Cal Hewitt opened the bottom left drawer of his desk and lifted out a file. Thick, 2 inches, at least the edges of the folders inside softened with age, the corners bent from years of being consulted and replaced. He set it on the desk between them and put both hands flat on top of it. His father, he said, Franklin Hewitt, had been Iris Calloway's attorney for 38 years, had helped Thomas Aldridge set up the trust in 1971, had paid the property taxes every year since from the trust account per Iris's standing instruction, continued after Iris's death per the terms of the will, had kept this file current and complete, and had told Cal before he died in 2012 that someone would come for it. He didn't know when Cal said, he just said, be ready. Cal had been ready for 12 years. Then he told her the other thing. Aldridge Land Partners had filed the preliminary paperwork for adverse possession 3 days ago. The full filing was scheduled for Thursday of the following week. Today was Wednesday. Nora had arrived with 1 day to spare. She opened the canvas bag and set the boxes on his desk one at a time. Land, trust, legal, personal. She unwrapped the green wool cloth from the 4th box and slid the birth certificate in its plastic sleeve across to him. Cal looked at each item carefully, unhurried. He read the birth certificate. He checked the trust statements against his own records. He read the correspondence from Aldridge Land Partners without any change in expression. Then he looked at her and said, everything matches. Everything is exactly what it should be. He asked if she was prepared to proceed. Nora said yes. The first filing went in that afternoon. Cal worked quickly and without wasted motion the way a man works when he has been mentally preparing for something for over a decade. He filed a notice of claim establishing Nora as the living heir to the Iris Calloway estate. He filed a motion to halt the Aldridge adverse possession proceeding. He attached the birth certificate, the land deeds, the trust documentation, and a certified copy of Iris's will, held in the Hewitt firm's vault since 1991, which named Leonora Calloway Ashford as sole beneficiary. The Aldridge response came in 2 days. 3 attorneys from a firm in Albany arrived at the county courthouse with a filing that was, Cal said when he called her impressively thorough for something assembled in 48 hours. They challenged the authenticity of the birth certificate. They challenged the chain of title on the land deeds. They filed a motion to freeze the trust account. And they filed a separate motion requesting that the court appoint a guardian on the grounds that the claimant was a homeless individual with no verifiable address making claims of an outlandish nature. That was the word they used, outlandish. Nora read it once and folded the document and put it with the others and started a fire in the fireplace for the first time since she'd arrived. She sat by the fire and thought about that word. She had lived 72 years. She had raised 3 children and kept a household and endured a marriage that was sometimes kind and sometimes not, and given her best years to other people's comfort without ever once asking for recognition. She had been thrown out of her son's house with $2 and had walked 11 blocks and ridden 6 hours on a bus and walked 3 miles on a gravel road in the dark on bleeding feet and had pried open a sealed door with a rusted iron railing because there was nowhere else on earth for her to go. And she had found what her mother left her. Outlandish. She put another log on the fire and let the word burn. The first hearing was on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after Cal's initial filing. The courtroom was small, as county courtrooms tend to be dark wood paneling, fluorescent lighting, the smell of old paper, and institutional carpet. Nora wore a dress she had bought at the thrift store on Main Street, dark blue wool fitted at the shoulders. She had found a pair of low heels in a consignment shop nearly her size and wore them with wool stockings because the October cold had settled permanently now. She sat at the plaintiff's table beside Cal and looked forward. The 3 Aldridge attorneys arranged their materials with the efficient confidence of people who win most of their cases. The lead attorney, a tall man with silver-framed glasses and a voice calibrated for projection, opened by describing Nora in terms that made her sound like a cautionary tale. An elderly homeless woman with no fixed address, no verifiable financial history, making claims against an established family with deep roots in the community, and a documented history of civic contribution going back 3 generations. He used the word outlandish again. Nora sat with her hands folded on the table and her back straight and her eyes forward. Cal responded with documents. He laid them out in sequence: the birth certificate, the chain of title, the trust records, the tax receipts going back 52 years, his own father's case notes from meetings with both Iris Calloway and Thomas Aldridge in 1971. He presented the will properly executed and witnessed held in continuous legal custody since 1991. The judge reviewed everything and ordered a 60-day discovery period. Outside on the courthouse steps, one of the Aldridge attorneys approached Cal and said in a tone meant to sound reasonable that his clients were prepared to discuss a settlement. A modest payment, a clean release of all claims. Nora, standing 2 steps below, said nothing. She looked at the attorney until he looked away. Then she walked down the remaining steps and turned toward Main Street. She had not come this far to settle. The hardest night came in the 4th week. Cal called in the evening, his voice carrying a particular flatness she had come to recognize as the sound of a problem he hadn't solved yet. The Aldridge team had hired a forensic document examiner from New York City. The examiner had submitted a preliminary report questioning the authenticity of the handwritten letter from Thomas Aldridge. The letter dated 1988, 4 years before his death, in which he had acknowledged Nora as his biological daughter and affirmed the trust. The examiner noted inconsistencies in ink aging and paper composition. If the motion to exclude succeeded, Cal said the case became significantly harder. They would need their own examiner. Someone in Washington, well-credentialed. 2 weeks for a report. Nora said to proceed. She put down the telephone and sat in the dark kitchen without lighting the lamp. The doubt that came in that darkness was not about Thomas Aldridge. She did not doubt the birth certificate or the trust or what her mother had told her in 2 pages of careful block print. She believed all of it with the certainty of something felt in the body before it is understood in the mind. What she doubted was whether believing something was enough, whether the truth as her mother had assembled it was strong enough to hold against the weight of money and lawyers and 3 generations of community standing. Iris had built something extraordinary in that cellar, but she had also died alone in a cold cabin because she had chosen the secret over the rescue. She had been right about some things, and she had paid a very high price for being right. Nora sat in the dark and let the doubt be there. She didn't fight it. You had to let it say what it came to say, and then decide what you were going to do in the morning regardless. She got up and lit the lamp. She went to the pantry shelf and took down the 4th box and brought it to the table. She went through it again now slowly in lamplight with the kind of attention that comes from having nothing left to lose. At the very bottom of the box beneath a folded piece of oilcloth she had taken to be wrapping material was a small envelope, smaller than the one on the mantel. The flap was simply folded in. Inside were photographs, 6 of them, black and white, small format. The first showed 2 people standing in front of a stone wall. A woman, young and dark-haired, with Iris's particular way of standing weight, even on both feet, shoulders back, looking at the camera, as if she had decided to let it take her picture, but was not going to perform for it. And a man beside her, taller in a work shirt, with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. The third photograph showed just the woman standing in front of the south wall of the cabin, the stone foundation visible. Iris in the summer, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed and her face turned slightly to the side and unmistakably pregnant. The remaining photographs showed the same 2 people on different days in and around the cabin and the surrounding land. In the 6th one, they were standing at the edge of the creek with the mountains behind them and the light coming in low and long from the west. On the back of the 6th photograph, in a rounder, more cursive hand than Iris's block print, were 6 words and a date. T&I, August 1950, our daughter. Thomas Aldrich had written those words. He had held this photograph and turned it over and written on the back of it before she was born, before she had a name, before any of it had become the complicated thing it became. He had known she was coming, and he had called her his. Our daughter. Nora put the photographs in a separate envelope and called Cal at 7 in the morning. The document examiner Cal brought in from Washington was a woman named Dr. Patricia Voss, small and unhurried, who spent 4 hours with a Thomas Aldrich letter and a set of comparison documents from his verified correspondence before she submitted her report. The ink was consistent with fountain pen formulations in common use in the late 1980s. The paper composition matched stock available and widely used in that period. The handwriting matched verified Aldrich samples at 17 distinct points of comparison. The aging patterns were consistent with genuine documents of that date and showed no evidence of artificial acceleration. The letter was authentic. The Aldrich motion to exclude was denied. And when Cal presented the 6 photographs at the following hearing, authenticated by Dr. Voss as consistent with small format photography of the early 1950s, the handwriting on the reverse confirmed as matching Thomas Aldrich's hand. The atmosphere in the courtroom changed. It changed quietly. Courtrooms rarely change any other way, but Nora felt it in the slight contraction in the Aldrich attorney's posture, the pause before responses that had previously been immediate. They had been operating on the assumption that the claim would collapse under pressure. The photographs did not collapse under pressure. They were her mother and her father standing at the edge of a creek in August light. They were a man writing on the back of a picture the 2 most important words he knew. They were the proof that whatever arrangement had been made between Iris Calloway and Thomas Aldrich, it had not been cold. There had been something between them that neither of them could fully protect or fully surrender, and they had each carried it in their own way until they died. Nora looked at those photographs in the courtroom and felt for the first time something toward Thomas Aldrich that was not simply the complicated recognition of a biological fact. She felt something closer to gratitude. The final hearing was on a Tuesday morning in late November. The Aldrich attorneys arrived with fewer documents than they had brought to previous hearings. The lead attorney made his remaining arguments carefully and professionally and without the word outlandish. And then Warren Aldridge walked in. Nora had not seen him before. He had not attended any previous hearing. He was in his late 60s, tall, with the kind of face that carries the evidence of its own history in the lines around the eyes and the set of the jaw. He was dressed simply, no suit, no performance. He walked to the front of the courtroom and sat down in the gallery, not at the attorney's table, and he looked at Nora. She looked back at him. This was her half-brother. She had not had a word for him before this moment. She had been focused on the legal reality of what she was claiming and had not spent much time on the human reality of what it meant for the family on the other side of it. He looked tired, not in the way of someone who hadn't slept, but in the way of someone who had been carrying something uncomfortable for a long amount of time and had finally arrived at the moment where they had to set it down in public. The lead attorney leaned over and exchanged several quiet words with his client. Warren listened, then he nodded once. The lead attorney stood and informed the court that the Aldridge parties were withdrawing all outstanding motions and objections. The judge looked over his glasses and asked for confirmation. The attorney confirmed. Cal, beside Nora, wrote something on his legal pad and slid it to her. 2 words, "It's done." Later in the hallway outside the courtroom, Cal told her what he had overheard. Warren had told his attorney that his father had left him a letter in 1988. A private letter kept in Warren's possession for 36 years, delivered through Franklin Hewitt as a separate document at the time of the trust amendment. In that letter, Thomas Aldridge had told his son the truth about Iris, about Nora, about the land and the trust and the arrangement that was settled and not to be challenged. If she comes, the letter had said, let her be. Warren had known for 36 years, he had hoped she would never come, that the property would eventually revert to the county and the whole thing would resolve itself without anyone sitting in a courtroom looking at the half-sister their father had kept secret. But she had come. And Warren Aldridge, when it was finally in front of him, when he was sitting in that courtroom, looking at a 72-year-old woman in a thrift store dress and his father's borrowed boots, who had crossed everything to claim what was hers, had chosen to honor his father's last instruction. Let her be. The judge issued his ruling. The land was hers. The trust was hers. The estate of Iris Calloway passed in full to Leonora Ashford as sole heir. Nora came back to the cabin alone. Cal dropped her at the gate, and she walked up through the field. The goldenrod cut back. Now the path clear, the broken gate rehung on new hardware she had bought at the hardware store 2 weeks earlier. She walked up to the porch and stood there for a moment looking at the door. The 2x4 lumber was gone. She had taken it down herself the second day and stacked it along the woodpile. The door was just a door now, plain and solid, with a new lock she had installed herself. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table and did not do anything for a while. And then she cried. Not for herself, or not only for herself. She cried for Iris Calloway, who had been a young woman with no power and no allies and no one to advocate for her, who had been offered money to go away quietly and had said no, who had spent the next 38 years in a cabin in upstate New York building something in secret for a daughter she barely got to know, who had died alone in the winter because she had chosen the secret over the rescue, who had trusted absolutely and without any guarantee that the door she built would hold until the right person needed it. It had held. Nora pressed her hands against the table and let herself cry until she was done. Then she washed her face at the sink and looked out the window at the field and the mountains and the late afternoon light going amber over everything, and she started making plans. The roof was replaced in December by a local contractor named Gil Mabry, who had known Iris slightly and charged Nora half his standard rate because he said any daughter of Iris Calloway deserved a fair deal. She paid what he asked and made him coffee and let him tell her what he remembered about her mother, which was not much, but was more than she had had before. The plumbing was brought up to code in January. A gas line was run from the road and a proper stove installed in February. Electricity came in March, not because the oil lamps were insufficient, but because she wanted a refrigerator that hummed and a reading lamp by the chair, and a telephone she didn't have to drive to town to use. She kept the tin cup on the windowsill above the sink, where Iris had kept it, where it had been kept for as long as the cabin had stood. She kept the jars of preserves on the pantry shelf, even the empty ones. She kept Iris's kitchen scissors in the small drawer to the right of the sink blade end back, where they had always been. In April, she leased 20 acres to a farmer named Douglas Pell, who ran cattle on the adjacent property and had been watching the Callaway land go to seed for years. He paid a fair rate and kept his word about the gates. In May, she donated 5 acres at the south end of the property to the town of Mill Haven for a community garden. The town council had been trying to establish one for 6 years and had been unable to secure land at a price they could afford. She attended the dedication in a folding chair in the back row and clapped when the other people clapped and drove home after without speaking to anyone. She kept the remaining land wild. The creek ran through it cold and clear. Deer came through the trees at dusk. Red-tailed hawks worked the thermal columns over the open fields on clear afternoons, circling without effort, held up by something invisible. It was quiet in the way that has nothing to do with silence and everything to do with peace. She called Garrett in June. The call lasted 90 seconds. She told him she was alive. She told him she was well. She told him she was home. He said he was glad. His voice carried the particular weight of a man who means what he says and also knows he forfeited the right to say it, the weight of 8 years of silence that had begun long before the morning of the coffee maker and had never once been addressed. He did not ask about Miriam. Nora did not mention her either. Some things between people reach a point where acknowledgement and forgiveness are two entirely separate roads, and not every road needs to be taken at once. She did not invite him to visit. She did not close the door. She left it where it was, the way you leave something when you have decided it belongs to the other person now. She put down the phone and went out to the garden and picked the first tomatoes of the season. The text from June came on a Thursday evening in July. Simple. 8 words. Grandma, are you okay? I've been thinking about you. Nora held the phone for a moment, sitting on the porch in the long summer light with the mountains going gold behind the tree line. She wrote back, I'm better than okay. Come see for yourself. June drove up on a Saturday 3 weeks later. 6 hours in a used Honda with a crack in the windshield and a passenger seat full of gas station snacks she offered to Nora before she even said hello. She stood in front of the cabin gate and looked at the stone foundation and the new roof and the garden in full summer production and said quietly that it was beautiful. Then she looked at Nora and her face changed. She cried before Nora said anything. She stood at the gate and cried with the particular quality of someone releasing something they have been holding for a long time, not grief exactly, but something made of guilt and relief and the belated understanding of what you did not do when you should have done it. She had stood at a window at 17 years old and watched and let the curtain fall and done nothing, and she had carried that every day since. Nora opened the gate and put her arms around her granddaughter and said nothing because nothing needed to be said about it. She brought her inside. She made lunch from the garden tomatoes, still warm from the vine basil from the pot on the windowsill, bread she had baked that morning in Iris's oven. They sat at the kitchen table and ate, and then Nora told her everything. Iris, Thomas Aldrich, the letter on the mantel, the hatch under the pantry rug, the 4 boxes, the birth certificate, the photographs of 2 people at the edge of a creek in August light, the Albany attorneys and the courtroom, and Warren walking in and looking at her across the room, and then finally letting her be. June listened to every word without interrupting. She asked what Iris had been like. She asked what it felt like to read the birth certificate for the first time. She asked about Warren. Then she asked, are you angry about any of it? Nora thought about the question seriously the way it deserved. She thought about Fletcher and the debt he had hidden. She thought about Garrett at the coffee maker. She thought about the morning of the flat palms on the counter and the deadline moved up and the latch that gave way. She thought about Harold Calloway, the ghost of a man who had never been her father, whose shadow had fallen across every room she had ever stood in and made it smaller. She thought about all the space she had not taken up, all the years she had made herself less than the room required. I was, she said, for a long time. She looked at the window, at the tin cup on the sill catching the afternoon light. Now I'm just here. June left at 6 in the evening, the Honda disappearing down the gravel road toward the county highway. At the end of the driveway, just before the road curved, the brake lights came on, and June put her hand out the window. Not a wave exactly, just a hand held up in the early evening air, open and still. Then the car went around the curve and the sound of it faded, and the ordinary sounds of the property came back: creek birds, the distant movement of Douglas Pell's cattle in the leased field. She'll come back, Nora thought. Not because she had to, because she wanted to. That was different from everything that had come before. She was 73 when the first full summer passed. She grew tomatoes and pole beans and basil in the garden behind the cabin. She read on the porch in the evenings when the light was good. She walked the full perimeter of the property twice a week, through the field and along the creek and up into the edge of the western forest and back. She learned where the deer bedded in the long grass near the creek. She learned where the hawks nested in the upper branches of the elm that had grown from the stone wall. She learned the property the way you learn something, when you finally decide you are allowed to know it. Some mornings she took the tin cup from the windowsill and filled it at the hand pump and drank the cold water of Iris's well, standing at the sink looking out at the field. Some mornings she just picked it up and turned it in her hands, the metal worn smooth on one side from years of being held, the rim slightly dented, the bottom carrying the faint circular mark of decades of use. She set it back on the sill in the light where it had always been, and she went on with the day. Iris Calloway had been a woman with no power and no allies and no one standing behind her, and she had built something that held for 50 years in the dark, and it had been exactly enough at exactly the right moment. She had not lived to see it used. She had not been thanked for it. She had died before her daughter was old enough to understand what had been prepared for her. That was the thing about that kind of love. It did not require an audience. It did not need to be witnessed or acknowledged or returned. It just did what it was built to do in the dark for as long as it took, and it held until the door was open from the other side. Iris had not left her a house. She had not left her the money, not really, or the land, not at the deepest level. She had left her a door, one that only Leonore Ashford could open, keyed to the one fact that was hers alone. The day she was born, the date her mother had written on a combination lock and tested again and again in the dark of a cellar alone, making sure it would work, making sure it would hold, making sure that when the time came and her daughter arrived at the end of everything she thought she had, the door would open. First try. And it had been enough. It had been, in the end, more than enough.